Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wizard. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Hello, Paul Hirsch. The last time I interviewed you, I had not read your book, and now that I have, I especially enjoyed the chapter to do with Bernard Herrmann. So let's bring it back to the beginning, though. When did you first become aware of Bernard Herrmann?
Well, it's so long ago I don't remember, but I think in reference to what you're talking about, I was working on a picture called Sisters, directed by Brian De Palma, and it was an independent production, and the producer, Ed Pressman, was trying to raise more money while we were shooting the film, and he wanted to have a screening of some of the material that had already been shot for potential backers and asked me to put something together to show them.
Mm-hmm.
And I had had some experience, even though Sisters is only my second film, and the first film was an underground, film
High
called.
Mom's a classic. I love that movie. I've got it right here, actually.
Well, Hi Mom may be a classic, but it cost about $100,000, and
Right.
I'd done it 3 years before, so I was very inexperienced, shall we say. So anyway, but I knew that you can't put on an impressive presentation without music.
Mm-hmm.
I needed some pre-recorded music to add to what I'd cut to make it effective. And the sequence that they had asked me to prepare was the murder sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, what am I going to use? So by coincidence, on television that night, they were showing Psycho. And I was watching the sequence where Janet Leigh is she's running away with the money that she's stolen, and she's being followed by a cop. And the sequence is incredibly tense.
Mm.
And I was watching it, and I noticed that the sequence was composed of only 3 shots. There was a close-up of her, there was a point of view of the road ahead, and there was a point of view of the rear view mirror where you saw the cop car behind her. And that was it. There were just 3 shots in the whole sequence. And it was incredibly tense. And I thought I had this, suddenly the light bulb went on over my head, and I turned off the sound, and the tension went away, and I turned it back on, and I thought,
Yeah.
it's the music, it's the music. So
Mm.
the next day I went to a record shop in Times Square, and I ordered. They didn't have it on hand, but I ordered the score from Psycho, and I had to spell Herman's name for the clerk, 2 R's, 2 N's, and it took a week to come in, and they got it, and I transferred the sound and laid it in, and showed it to Brian, and he was floored. He had seen the sequence before without music, but with music, I had used the shower music from Psycho. It just knocked him out, and that was the beginning of our pursuing and hiring Herman for the film.
So let's do a little contextualization for the time period. But
Yeah.
before you met to work with him on Sisters, what was Bernard Herrmann's relationship like in Hollywood?
Well, Benny had come out to Hollywood. His very first film was Citizen Kane. He had worked with Wells in the Mercury Theater on radio, and
Oh,
he
okay.
and he conducted an orchestra for CBS. So he was known primarily for his radio work. And then, of course, his very first film was Citizen Kane. He did another film the following year called The Devil and Daniel Webster, for which he won an Oscar. So,
Good movie.
good movie, yeah. And so he was one of the Hollywood composers working at that time. He was a contemporary of Alfred Newman and Miklos Rocha and Max Steiner, and these were the heavy hitters in Hollywood. And Benny worked primarily for a while with Alfred Hitchcock, and they worked together on some of the most iconic Hitchcock films. And then they had a falling out. Benny was a very sensitive man. When I say sensitive, I mean touchy, and he had an explosive um, temper.
Yeah.
And he was not always in control of his emotions. I would say primarily his emotions were in control of him.
Mhm.
And I don't really know what went on between, no one will ever know what went on between him and Hitchcock, but he wrote a score for Torn Curtain and Hitchcock threw it out.
Mm.
And he said something dismissive like, oh, the same old shit.
Mhm.
So Benny was so hurt that he moved to England. He left Hollywood and moved to England and had been living there for several years. And his career in Hollywood had come to a halt. And he did some films in England that didn't have much of a profile in the United States.
Mhm.
And after this screening, and with my encouragement, and Brian and Ed Pressman wrote him. In fact, we didn't even know he was alive. We thought, well, is he
Yeah.
alive? Where is he? Who is, where is Benny Herrmann? Bernard Herrmann. We didn't know he was called Benny. His nickname is Benny.
Mhm.
So he was living in London. They sent him the script. He liked the script, and he agreed to come to New York to see the film. So that was when I met him for the first time.
So, what was it like to be on the receiving end of him yelling at you during that first meeting?
Uh,
Okay.
it wasn't the very first meeting. The first meeting was.
You heard the music, though.
Oh yeah, all that. Yes.
Yeah.
So after I had put this psycho music in for the murder sequence, Brian then encouraged me to put music throughout the whole film.
Mhm.
And I'm not a music editor, and I can do it kind of, but I'm not as skilled as a music editor. And I was working on Mag, and we only had a limited number of tracks to work with, so some of the cuts I made were brutal. And Brian would say, "Don't worry about it. It's just broad strokes, broad strokes. He'll understand. This is just to give him the idea of what we're thinking of, And I said, I don't know, So I was kind of embarrassed by the bad cuts, But so anyway, we went to this screening room. We arranged for this screening for Benny to be in a room where they could run two tracks at the same time. One was my work track with all the dialogue, and the second was the music track. And they had to be mixed live because we didn't have the money to do a mix before the screening, or the time for that matter. So I was one who was tasked with doing the mix while he was watching the film because I was the only one who knew the tracks well enough. So we got all set and we started to roll. And the minute the first music came in, Benny jumped out of his seat like he'd been electrified, and he said, "Stop, stop, turn that music off. I don't want to hear this music. It's all wrong. It's all wrong." So I was terrified, and I leaned over to the intercom to talk to the projectionist to tell him to turn the music off. And he couldn't hear me. He started yelling, and you could hear his voice through the booth in the room. So I thought, oh, hell. So I ran out of the room, and I ran into the booth, and I said, don't put up the music tracks anymore. Just put up the single track, And he said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, I already loaded it for the second reel." I said, well,
Yeah.
just leave it alone, So we got through the screening with no music, and of course, it was very tense in the room, especially on my part. But anyway, Brian wasn't feeling great either. So we got to the end, and then Benny said, "What are you going to do about a main title?" So Brian said, "Well, we were going to put the titles over the scene. No, you can't do that. You have to have a main title." He says, "Well, we weren't thinking of having a main title." He says, "You got to have a main title. The murder doesn't happen for 30 minutes." So Brian says, "Well, in such and such a film with, he mentioned a Hitchcock film, nothing happened, The Man Who Knew Too Much, or whatever it was."
Mm-hmm.
He says, "You're not Hitchcock. The audience sees Hitchcock's name, they'll wait half an hour. For you, they won't. You have to have a main title to prepare the audience psychologically for the experience they're going to have." So that was it. He laid down the law. And then he relaxed a little. He says, "This film reminds me a bit of Psycho when I first saw it." And Brian and I were suddenly, really, and he says, yeah, he says when Hitchcock first saw it, he wanted to. He was very discouraged. And he wanted to turn it into a TV show. We thought, wow, that's shocking. But we were encouraged, and then Ed showed up. Ed Pressman, the producer, showed up, and no, we met him for lunch at his club.
Right.
So the four of us went to lunch. It was Pressman and Brian and Herman and myself.
Mm-hmm.
And during the lunch, Benny said, "I want to have so many musicians, and it's going to cost." For some reason, I remember $25,000, but at that time, this is 1972, that was a lot of money. So anyway, Ed Pressman, who was paying for the for the film, I think he was paying for the film through his family business. They had a toy company, the Pressman Toy Company. But anyway, he said, "Gee, Benny, that's a lot of money." And Herman said, "When you buy a Rolls Royce, you don't ask how many miles you get to the gallon." So Brian said to Ed, "Let's go talk. Come with me. Let's go talk."
Mm-hmm.
So they left, and I was left alone with Benny, and I was thrilled. And he said, "By the way, you get 9 miles a gallon. I know because I own one." Okay. I said, "Well, Ed seemed to, be a little nervous about the cost." He says, "I'm not used to working on chintzy productions." So
This is like a
anyway,
cantankerous man.
he was, really was. He was. I thought he was so old when I saw him. I was
Yeah,
26 at the time. He
right.
was 61, but I
Oh.
thought he was ancient. Now 61 does, seems
No.
61 seems like a kid to me.
Right.
So, but from my perspective, then he was just very old and really touchy and cranky.
He must have had some great stories, though, right? About Orson Welles and Alfred Hitchcock. Tell
Well,
me
yeah,
about some of the stories he told you.
he was a great raconteur, and he would tell these stories about like you say, Orson Welles and Cary Grant and Joan Fontaine and various stars that he'd known. And Brian and I were eating this up because we were, like I said, I had only done one film before, and that was 3 years earlier. It was a
Mhm.
$100,000 independent film, and we were barely sort of in the business. And here was a guy who'd been at the heart of Hollywood, working with the most famous names you can think of. And we were just, I was rapt, and Brian was, he was too, I'm sure. And he said, Cary Grant came up to me one day and he said, "Why won't Hitch talk to me? Why is he upset with me?"
Mm.
And things like that. So just fantastic stories.
That's fantastic stuff. That's great stuff. And
So,
to me, it was really interesting because I love, what they call it, the Hitchcockian De Palma movies. And I always just assumed with Sisters, and then Obsession, of course, that it was his idea to bring over Bernard Herrmann. He's doing the Hitchcock sort of thing, like with his own twist. Obviously, I'm not saying he's this like ripoff guy, but I know some people say that, but I had always just assumed that he had reached out to Bernard Herrmann, but it was your idea.
well, it was, yeah. And somebody wrote a review of the film and said, you would think that when, with making a film with so many Hitchcockian touches in it,
Mm-hmm.
Brian De Palma would have thought to hire his composer, but it was me. And Brian wrote an article for the Village Voice explaining how I had presented him with this suggestion and how successful it had been and how they came to hire Herman for the film. And but anyway, before all this, getting ahead of ourselves, Benny went off to England to write the score for the film, and he came back for the mix
Mm-hmm.
uh, that summer. And we were working our way through, and the murder takes place in reel 3, and we were mixing reel 1 and reel 2, and Benny was sitting on a couch in front of the console, and I was sitting next to the mixer. Brian and I were both sitting next to the mixers, so we could talk to them. And hear it from where they're hearing it from. We're all getting the same experience. So anyway, we come up to the murder in reel 3, and there's no music. And Benny, who had been sort of nodding off, suddenly jumps up and he yelled, "Where's the music, Paul?" without turning around. He said, "Where's the music, Paul?" And the music mixer, whose name was Bob Fine, started to say, "No, the music's there. I just missed my cue, But
Yeah.
all Benny heard was no. And he thought, because he had addressed me, he thought I was saying, no, there's no music there.
Yeah.
And then he whirled around and he faced me and he said, "What do you mean there's no music there?" If I try to do Benny, I'll ruin my voice.
Right, bet.
But he was really furious, "What do you mean there's no music there?" I mean, it was terrifying, and I wrote it, I recorded it. You're insolent. How dare you? You're incompetent. I'm going to report you to the union. I wasn't even in the union. But, he went on and on like this, and I hadn't said a word. And he was screaming at me, and veins standing out in his head, and spittle coming out of his mouth, and I was just, I was like a heap of cinder, and everyone in the room knew I hadn't said a word.
Right, but it didn't matter. Yeah.
But he just got, on a roll, and so at the end of the day, I went over to Brian. I said, I didn't know what to do. He said, "Don't worry, you were fine. Just don't say." And from then on, I couldn't say anything in the mix because anything I said, Benny would say, "No, that's terrible." So I started whispering to Brian. He said, "Why don't we, And so Brian would say, "Benny, what if we, yeah, let's try that. That's, So I was persona non grata. It was bad. So I was crushed because, it had been my idea and I worshiped this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then he turned on me in such, savage anger. And I was crushed. I was really crushed.
I bet. Let's fast forward a little bit to Obsession. I would love to hear about because I was rereading those chapters, and I love when you talk about how when he was listening to the music, he started crying sort of profusely, and everyone left the room because it was sort of uncomfortable. But he said something else that was pretty interesting, which was he didn't remember writing the music.
Yeah,
it sort of just came out of him through his pores, I guess, and he loved the melancholia of the piece of Obsession.
Yeah.
So tell me about being in the room with him when he was crying.
You just told my story.
Okay. Well, I just reread the book, but yeah. Okay.
Well,
there's nothing else to say, I guess.
What you said. I mean,
what was different with Obsession, though? What was it? Was that
when he showed up? I didn't know how he was going to react to me. This is 3 years later now.
Mm-hmm.
He'd come to New York to see the screening of the film, and once again, we had to convince the producer, in this case George Leto, hire Benny by tracking the film with. This time we used the music from Vertigo.
Yeah.
And so that sort of sold the idea to George, and he hired Benny, and Benny shows up in New York, and he said, "Brian, I can't do the picture."
Mm-hmm.
I thought, he flew from London to New York to tell us he can't do the picture? So Brian said, "Well, what's wrong, Benny?" He says, "Well, it's that Lito. He wants me to take a physical, And, in fact, he was quite ill. He had a heart condition, and anyway, they smoothed it out, and he was hired on the film. At that first meeting, when he first came over, I wasn't sure how he would react to seeing me, and he saw me and he said, "Paul, my boy, how are you? It's good to see you. It's so wonderful." And he turned to somebody next to him. He says, "This is the best young editor in the business." So
that must have been strange, but also a relief.
Oh, it was an incredible relief. Yeah, I went from whipping boy to golden boy. So, so then it was a whole different experience with working with him the second time. And then he and I developed a friendship, and we would work on the film, spotting the music. And then
Mhm.
we went to, if we would go to lunch, we'd walk around the corner. There was a record store there, and now they had bins with his scores in them, and I
Mhm.
would thumb through the LPs, and he'd say, "Get that one, that's a good one. And don't get that one, that's rubbish," and this is good, And he said, helped me pick out a bunch of his LPs,
That's
and I had him over to the house, and we had a dinner party in his honor, and my brother came with some small dogs and his girlfriend, and Benny had a great time. He loved the little dog, and he loved the
oh.
young women, and uh, anyway, it was very, very rewarding. And then we went to London to do the recording of the score. On Sisters, they hadn't sent me over there, and Brian said it was the most thrilling experience of his life. So I thought, I'm not going to miss this one. So I asked Lito if he was going to send me to London, and he said, "No, we're not paying for you." So I thought, well, I'm paying for myself then, because I'm not going to miss this. So we flew over there on my own dime, and the recording was held in a church on a remote setup, recording setup, and the sessions were to go from 7 to 10 on 3 nights in a church, St. Giles of Cripplegate, in the um, in the part of London, sort of like the financial district,
Mhm.
and in the Barbican. And so it was a fantastic atmosphere. We're in this church, and the score makes use of the church organ quite a bit.
Yeah.
It was a choir and full orchestra, and we started these sessions. And Benny was conducting, but as I say, he had been quite ill, and he was kind of frail, and he was having a little trouble hitting the cues. And anyway, at some point, the one of the lead French horn player hit a bad note,
Mhm.
and Benny threw down his baton. He says, "That's the most erratic horn playing I've ever heard in my life." And the horn player stood up. He says, "Well, you're the worst bleeding conductor I've ever seen in my life." And he starts to pack up his instrument and go.
Yeah.
So panic, chaos erupted. And then, the contractor said, "Benny, Benny said, let him go, get somebody else." It's like 8 o'clock at night. We're downtown. He said, "We're going to get a horn player at 8 o'clock at night."
Yeah.
They called at 10, and they took the guy aside, and they talked to him, and they tried to calm him down, and bought him a beer or whatever. And um, anyway, they continued on, and um, Benny, a friend of Benny's named Laurie Johnson, is a composer, took over the conducting, and it all worked out. But anyway, we finished the score, and we came back to New York the following week to do the mix, and we mixed all the music into the film. We went to the screening room to play it back.
Mhm.
The first time that you hear the music from the beginning to the end in the time that it was designed to fill.
Mhm.
So it's really the first experience any of us had of the score, and of the experience that the audience was going to have. So we get to the end, and the lights come on, and Benny is weeping. He's sitting there weeping,
Nice.
and we're all sitting in silence, and he keeps crying, and finally people start getting up and leaving. And so anyway, finally he and I are left alone. Brian says, "Well, I'm going to head back to the studio. I'll meet you over there. We have a few things I want to fix." I said, "Okay." And then finally Benny calmed down, and he was quite frail. He walked with a walking stick, and I was carrying an attaché case for him. And we made our way outside, and it was very hot. It was an August day in New York. It was very hot. We got a cab, and we get into the cab, and we're sitting there in traffic, stuck in traffic, not going anywhere. He was still sniffling, and I reached over and I patted him on the arm, and I said, "Benny, it's a beautiful, beautiful score." And he said, "I don't remember writing it." And I got a chill at that moment, and I thought to myself, "Oh no!" And then he said, "All I know is I woke up one morning at 2 I woke up one morning at 2 and I thought, there's got to be a chorus. And I thought to myself, this is like, the angels came to him in a dream, So anyway, I learned later that it's not uncommon for composers not to remember writing the music. The famous quote from Stravinsky is that um, I was just talking about the Rite of Spring. He says, I was just a vessel, it poured through me.
Mm.
So, but anyway.
That's amazing, though.
Yeah, and then we finished the film, and he was flying back to London a few days later, and he had gotten a crush on my assistant, this young woman,
Okay.
Deborah, and he had invited her to dinner at Sardi's a few blocks away, and Deborah had to stay in the cutting room to give a package that was being picked up, to make sure the package was picked up, and she said to me, I have to go to see Benny. Would you mind waiting? Could you hand the package to the messenger? When you come. I said, okay. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, this is wrong. Benny's at the restaurant at Sardi's with my assistant, and I'm sitting here waiting for a messenger. It doesn't seem right,
Yeah.
Then she called up and she said, Benny wants you to come over. I said, okay. And I felt better, so I went over there, and he said, I wanted to tell you why I was so upset the other night.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, yeah, why? And he said, well, he says, when the picture ended, I felt like the characters had left me.
Right.
He felt abandoned because he had spent weeks and months trying to understand the psychology, the internal lives of the characters, and then interpreting their emotions through the music to express what they're feeling.
Mm.
So he had been so closely bonded with them that when the picture finished, he felt like he'd been left behind.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a broad question, but how do you think his emotional state affected his musical style?
It's a hard one to answer. I mean, I don't really know. He wrote joyous music too. I mean,
Yeah.
um, I think he had a dark side to him, and he had his music doesn't sound like anyone else's.
Yeah.
At least not anyone else who was writing film music. I mean, when I hear his music, sometimes I'm reminded of some of Ravel's work, and there are things that echo for me from classical music, but I don't really know of any uh, of the other film composers who had that sort of kind of dark cast to their music the way he had.
Yeah, and of
And
course,
of course,
his last
his
film
last
was for Taxi Driver,
yeah.
and you talked to him while he was finishing that, or was he done it? I'm not sure. Can you tell us a little bit about that final meeting?
Yeah, he came to New York to screen Taxi Driver, and we made a date for dinner, and his daughter was there, um, Taffy, and the three of us were having dinner at the Regency, I think it's called. Anyway, it's a hotel on Park Avenue, 61st Street.
Mm-hmm.
So we're sitting there having dinner, and during dinner, the maitre d' comes over and he says, Mr. Herrmann, there are two young men outside who want to see you. And he says, tell them to go away. Why don't they leave me alone? So after dinner, we start to make our way out, and there, of course, in the lobby are these two young guys with big coffee table books of Hitchcock's films.
Yeah.
And they come up, with a pen in hand, and Mr. Herrmann, would you sign our books? And I thought he was going to hit them with his walking stick, And instead, he took one of the books and he started writing a musical staff and
Right.
treble clef, and he started writing notes and signed it, and then he did the same with the other book, and they were thrilled and they walked away. I said, Benny, what was that? He says, I wrote them the opening notes of Psycho. So he was he could also be kind, even though he had a crusty exterior.
And he said something like Taxi Driver made sisters look like Sunday school, or what was the quote?
I said, how's the picture? He says, oh, it's very violent. I said,
Yeah.
really? Oh, yeah, very violent. I said, more violent than Sisters? He said, this picture makes Sisters look like a Sunday school picnic.
Yep. It's great stuff. Paul, thanks so much for your time today to talk to me about Bernard Herrmann. It was a really fascinating part in your wonderful book, which is available now on paperback. Am I right?
Yeah, it just came out in paperback beginning of May.
Yeah,
It's a perfect gift for graduates and Father's Day.
absolutely. Before I let you go, could you give current composers a piece of advice to make their music as powerful as Benny's?
No, I can't. You know, that music goes through different vogues, and right now the film music that's being written is I don't quite understand. I mean, I understand it, but I'm not really uh, in love with what's being written these days because
Mhm.
it seems like the criticism that music tells you how to feel has worked some insidious influence, and I think directors are afraid to include melodic or thematic music in their films, and what they're asking for are just tones or
Mhm.
pulses, or so it's more akin almost to a kind of emotional sound effect than to music. I'm not particularly thrilled about film music these days.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it on that note. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.